Texas A&M University's College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences Peer Program's continuing video conference series. This morning, Dr. Meredyth Jones from the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine's Large Animal Field Services will be talking to us about herd health, how to protect communities of animals and of people. This is an important topic as our world learns the significance of animal health, plant health, and human health, and how we impact each other. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy this discussion.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Meredyth Jones. I'm a veterinarian here at Texas A&M University. I have a couple of aspects to my job. One is that I provide veterinary care to farms and ranches here in the state of Texas. I also teach veterinary students, so as I provide that care on farms and ranches, I have veterinary students that are with me. And I also do some research primarily in beef cattle and meat goats, but I really enjoy first and foremost providing service to cattle producers and goat producers, and from time to time llamas and alpacas and camels and other such creatures as well. So that's the primary part of my job. And so what I want to talk to you guys about today is a topic about herd health. As a veterinarian, we deal a lot with populations of animals. Most people think of a veterinarian as sort of fixing the individual sick animal. So someone has a sick dog and they bring it into the veterinarian, sick cat, sick cow, sick horse. And we certainly do that with a large percentage of our time. But another part of our time that we really value the most is we really like to prevent disease as well. We would prefer that sick animals not occur, or that we at least limit that significantly. And so what we're going to talk about today is the veterinarian's role in preventing disease, how we try to keep sick animals from occurring, and how we look at herd health and the population of animals. So I'm going to click to the first slide here. As I said, we're going to talk about protecting the herd. We'll talk about animals first, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the human herd as well. So when we talk about herd health, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about a herd health program. And what that usually entails from the large animal side is, for example, I will go into a client's farm or ranch. Actually today, after I get finished here with you guys, I'm going to drive about 6 hours west here in Texas and go to about a 400 cow-calf operation, do some vaccinations of this year's calves, and sort of do exactly what we're going to talk about here today. We'll be doing that later this afternoon. And so what we're talking about here is a herd health plan. And so I usually go onto an operation and I look at the land, I look at the cattle or goats or whatever species they have, horses, and I evaluate their risk. And we'll talk a little bit about how we manage risk in a later slide. But I look at what diseases are most likely to be of concern in that area. We know that diseases vary by operation and by geography. Certain areas of the country have certain diseases and others, they don't happen there very often. We look at the general nutrition and the health of the animals, the type of environment that we're in, and we decide how can we manage those cattle, sheep, goats in such a way as to prevent disease. When we talk about what our goals are for a herd health plan, we want to find out which diseases there are that are of the largest risk, and we want to prevent those diseases from ever showing up, or we'd like to prevent them from spreading once they do show up. And certainly we know that it is impossible to completely prevent all disease from occurring. When you think about flu in people, for example, they come out months in advance and they say, get your vaccinations, wash your hands, sneeze into your elbow, all those sorts of things to try to prevent that, but we still get the flu. And so you never completely get rid of that. But we want to make sure that we prevent that from occurring at a very high level. And so things that we consider when we're looking at the herd, I've already alluded to some of these. We want to look at the environment. Very important to know, do they get a lot of rain? Do they have a largely dry environment like what you're seeing in this slide where these goats are? Certain diseases like damp, moist environments. Certain diseases do really well when it's dry and dusty. And so we need to know kind of how that looks there. We want to look at exposure. One of the biggest things for exposure is, do they have animals coming and going into the herd on a regular basis? Do they have new animals showing up who might have carried something in from their previous farm or ranch and bring it into the herd? And we'll talk about biosecurity, which is how we manage that a little later on. We do look at nutrition, and nutrition is very important. And the reason for this is that protein and minerals like magnesium, calcium, all those sorts of trace minerals, cobalt, copper, are very important in an animal's immune system and allowing that immune system to function normally. And so if you're going to be exposed to a disease, you would like to have as strong of an immune system as you can in order to be able to fight that off. And so nutrition is extremely important on the animal side. It is also just as important on the human side. And so we are very concerned when we see animals who may have a questionable environment of nutrition. We see issues with that when there's a drought, for example, and there's not enough grass, not enough grain being grown to feed those animals, and so that always becomes a concern. We get worried about those animals being susceptible to disease at those times. We also look at stress. You are probably very aware that sometimes you get sick when you're getting ready for a big test. Sometimes you get sick after the big test, those sorts of things. And so we know that stress has the ability to suppress the immune system, and it really shuts your body down when you're stressed. And so if you have exposure from the environment in some way to a disease and you're stressed, you are less likely to be able to really fully respond to that threat. We do look at stocking rates, and what stocking rate means is basically, in my business, it is the number of animals per unit of land. So we look at it in 6 cows per acre, or 20 cows per acre, or 1 cow per acre. How many animals are there for this unit of land? And so we look at the total number of acreage that those animals have access to and how many animals are on that. And where this is important is, if there is an infectious agent, virus, bacteria, whatever it is, that gets into a herd in some way, the closer the animals are together, the more likely they are to spread it around. And so we think about if it's something that's spread by a sneeze, or what we call nasal droplet in animals, if it's spread by nasal droplet and I sneeze and my neighbor is right next to me, I'm much more likely to spread that to them than I am if they're a mile over that way. And so that becomes a very important in stocking density. And it's actually, we don't think about stocking density too much in people, but I'm sure you guys can all think of examples where in your classroom, where all of you are sort of crowded in there, if somebody gets a cold, everybody gets a cold, and it's because you're in a small sort of confined environment. And so it becomes a stocking density issue, even though that's an agricultural term, but it applies to your classrooms, it applies to your family at home. And so finally, we'll talk about individual resistance. We know that certain animals have some genetic, we think it's genetic, we know there's some genetic component to this, where they are sort of inherently resistant to disease. You guys can all probably think of situations where everybody seems to get sick, but there's kind of this one person that doesn't ever seem to get sick. My dad, for example, never seems to get sick. And so it does appear as though there are individual characteristics. We don't know what all of those are, but we do know that genetics plays a role, where some animals, some people are just more susceptible to disease than others, or are more resistant to disease than others. And so I mentioned the term biosecurity earlier when I was talking about bringing diseases in. I'll start with the definition of biosecurity. So it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It is securing the area or the herd away from biological problems, viruses, bacteria, any other sort of disease-causing agent. And so when you have biosecurity in a herd, what you are talking about is the plan for keeping diseases out of that herd. And so when we come up with a plan for biosecurity, we look at the way those animals are managed, or the production management. So are those animals being moved around a lot? Are animals constantly being brought into that operation? When those sorts of things are occurring, there is the possibility then for diseases to be brought in and diseases to be spread around. So we need to know what is the goal of the producer, of the owner, and how is he sort of getting that accomplished, and how might that, the way he's doing that operation, how might that contribute to disease? We also need to know about disease biology, and this is really where veterinary training comes in. We are trained in school to know how viruses and bacteria work, how they're spread, how they act once they're in the body, and those sorts of things. So having a knowledge of how things spread and how they behave, that disease biology, allows us to then come up with a plan about how to control it. Under the heading of management, also, we talked a little about risk assessment, and that's a term that it's kind of becoming a buzzword in our line of work. And what this basically is, it goes back to what I was saying about that you really can't prevent every single disease. And you wouldn't really want to necessarily if that was a disease that wasn't important in your area. So for example, if you lived in a part of the country where a disease like anthrax almost never occurs, you wouldn't want to spend a lot of time and money figuring out how to prevent anthrax if it really wasn't a threat in your area. And so this also comes into importance where the veterinarian takes the role, because the veterinarians, that is our job, to sort of know what diseases are important in that area. We also know that there are certain diseases that are more common in a certain breed or a certain species. Some things are going to affect goats that aren't going to affect cattle, those sorts of things. And so that's where we come in and say, based on how this herd is managed, what species this herd is, whether it's sheep, goats, cattle, whatever it is, and based on the geography, here are the list of diseases that we think have the potential to cause the most damage, and here are the ones that we think probably aren't that big a deal, and we're not going to spend a lot of time, energy, and money into preventing those diseases. The last thing on this slide is talking about record keeping, and this is extremely important. As you can imagine, animals don't know their own names, and so it's very important we tag or tattoo or brand them so that we know who's who. We need to know if number 57 got sick, we need to know how to monitor those that are around her and how to monitor her. If you haven't seen cattle herds before, you may not know that they all kind of look the same. If somebody raises black Angus cattle, you look out amongst those cows and there's just a lot of black cows out there. And so it's impossible to say, was this the one who was sick last week and now she looks better or worse? And so we need to have identification in them. And that then should feed into a record system. We need to, as veterinarians, to be able to come into a herd and look through their records and say, this is a disease that's becoming more common, this is something that they're seeing in this herd more. We used to do all this with paper and pencil, good old-fashioned pen and paper, and that's been very common for many years and still gets done. A lot of our producers carry a little notepad in their chest pocket and keep track of things that way, and I can certainly thumb through one of those notepads. But one of the things that's getting used a lot more now, as you can imagine, is either our cell phones and our iPads and tablet PCs. You'd be surprised at how many ranchers use their iPhone to keep their records. Many times when I ask to see a herd's records, the guy pulls his smartphone out of his pocket and hands it to me, and he can look up and say, that calf was sick, here's exactly what I treated it with, here was the date and time that I treated it. And there are a lot of really great software programs that help us track herd health in that way. And so we've really jumped this into the 21st century, which really allows us to search and really do a more effective job than thumbing through the old notepad used to do. As I said, we can never overestimate the importance of this prevention. The stocking density is very important. We would like for cattle to be as spread out as possible with regards to their housing. We do house cattle and other animals in more confined operation, and when that occurs, that is because we are attempting to use the land more efficiently. And so we will, in certain terrains, in certain areas, keep animals more animals in a smaller area as a means of making the most effective use out of the land. Providing good nutrition is ultimately important, as I've already said. There are veterinarians who specialize in nutrition, that is their primary interest, and so it's a very important career choice there. I certainly look back and wish that I had had more training in nutrition than I did. I do nutrition work every single day, and I think, gosh, this should have been something that I spent more time on, and so I'm constantly learning about nutrition in particular. There are also other careers in livestock nutrition. Outside of veterinary medicine, there are livestock nutritionists, and we rely heavily on those as veterinarians to help us in this area and make sure that we're providing the best nutrition, protein, energy, trace minerals, all those sorts of things to these animals as they're growing and producing. We do want to decrease exposure. You can have all the protection you want in the world, but if you receive an overwhelming dose of whatever disease agent there is, bacteria or virus, your body may just not be able to overcome that. And so that becomes a concern there. Anytime we can reduce stress on animals, we want to do it. Just like in people, stress causes a lot of health issues and certainly diminishes our ability to respond to disease. And so we try to handle cattle in low stress ways, work them smoothly and quietly, get them through. If we need to move them around, we try to do that as efficiently as possible to reduce the stress on them. We try to protect them from weather challenges. We put up shade, those kinds of things to try to give them a break from some of those some environmental conditions that can cause stress. So any way that we can think of that those cattle are stressed, we try to reduce that as much as possible. Finally, we're going to spend a little time talking about vaccinations. Certainly, when most people think about preventing disease, the first thing they think of is, well, let's vaccinate against it. And I do want to talk about vaccine, but I also want to really drive home the point that you can give all the vaccine you want in the whole wide world, and if those first 5 or 6 things there on that list are not being controlled, then the vaccine doesn't have a chance of working. And the reason for that is the way a vaccine works is that your body is presented through an injection or some oral vaccines, depending on how it's formulated. Your body is presented with an inactive or killed version of the disease-causing agent, virus or bacteria typically. And so your body has to have a good immune response to that vaccine in order for that to really be able to work. So if you don't have the right stocking density, if you don't have the correct nutrition, if you have a lot of exposure, those kinds of things, your vaccine doesn't really have a chance to work. So we talk about protective immunity, protection against disease, and there are 2 main things that we look at. One is called innate immunity, and one is called acquired immunity. Innate immunity, you can think about that as sort of generic immunity. It's not really specific to a specific disease agent, so if we think about the flu, innate immunity is kind of generic immunity to sort of everything that your body doesn't want in it. Versus acquired immunity, you develop that against a specific agent. So when you are exposed to the flu, either in natural life when someone sneezes on you, or as a vaccine, you develop immunity to that, and that's acquired. So you develop that as a specific response to a specific threat. We also talk about clinical versus subclinical cases. And clinical cases are animals who are actually sick. So when somebody in the room is coughing or sneezing, that is a clinical case of whatever is causing their cold. There are also animals and people then who are carrying the disease but may not be showing outward signs. And those are what we call subclinical. So they're below showing clinical signs. And if you look at the bottom of this slide with this picture on it of the iceberg, this is kind of a classic picture that we use to describe the difference between clinical and subclinical disease. If you look at the water line, you see that there's a little bit of the iceberg sticking out of the top, and we think about that as being the clinical cases. And so if you have a herd of 100 cows and 4 of them are sick, those are the 4. They're the ones sticking up above the water that you can see, and they are clinical, and you know that they're sick. What you also have to think about is the huge iceberg that is underneath the water that you can't see. And in really contagious and infectious diseases, we get worried about who are the other 96 cows that may be also harboring the disease but not yet showing clinical signs. And so it's always important for us to remember that we do have animals right in front of us who are sick, and we need to help them, but we also need to make sure that we deal with any subclinical infections or sort of that part of the iceberg that is under the water. And so we talk about vaccines. You'll see this picture in the screen. We use vaccines, again, to prevent disease. We would prefer, as I said, everyone thinks of veterinarians that we all want to treat sick animals, and we do. That is part of the job that we love. But we would like to prevent disease as much as possible. We would prefer to spend our time preventing disease rather than treating disease. And vaccines are an important way to do that, and we can really reduce the use of medications that way. And so you'll see in that picture. They're vaccinating a calf there with what we call a pistol grip syringe. We don't use these on people or cats, as you can imagine. But this allows us to vaccinate large numbers of cattle. We fill this up with vaccine, and we pull the trigger, and we can vaccinate large numbers of cattle at a very rapid pace. This is an example of a vaccine that we commonly use in cattle. It prevents a disease that's commonly called blackleg, and so we use these in combination to be able to run cattle through. And as I alluded to before, later today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go use these and keep some calves, hopefully, from developing some disease, and see if we can prevent disease that way. As I also said before, one size doesn't fit all. Not every herd or ranch has the same risk factors, and so we need to know the risk for the individual herd, and that really is the job of the veterinarian, to be able to come in there and say that. The other thing that's important for people to remember, and I think a lot of folks forget, is there isn't a vaccine for every disease. And so sometimes I'll diagnose a disease in a herd and the client will say, well, is there a vaccine for that? And sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. There are many more diseases than not that don't have a vaccine associated with them. And so we need to keep that in mind, and that's why we talk so much about management of diseases outside of vaccines, because vaccines are not the answer to everything, although they are extremely important. And so as I talked about with the records analysis, in herds where I have a relationship with the producer and I'm monitoring that herd's health plan, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to look at his records and I'm going to see how things have gone. So if I go in there every 3 or 4 months or go in there once a year, I want to see what happened. I obviously can't be there every day, and so I use those records as a mechanism to be there every day and see how things are going. How many of the cows get pregnant? How many of the cows have calves? How many of those calves make it to a good weight at weaning? Those sorts of things are what I'm going to look at to evaluate the production of the whole herd. And so as a review for this, just a kind of a little algorithm here to show you how we do this. We want to start out with a herd health plan. That is the biosecurity plan. That is a nutrition plan. That is the plan for stocking density. It's going to include a deworming plan, parasite control plan, vaccine plans. Those sorts of things are going to be an important part of that plan. We would like to come up with that plan prior to diseases being a problem in that herd. Unfortunately, many times we don't have that opportunity. The veterinarian only gets called in when there's a problem, and so we sort of develop that plan kind of coming in behind a disease. And so you're a little bit behind the 8 ball there, but that's the reality of life, and so we can come in and do that. Then we want to go through and investigate the herd health status. I'm going to go in and review those records. I'm going to see what I think the risk is for that herd or for that geographic area and those sorts of issues. We'd like to prevent introduction, as I said. That's going to focus largely on that biosecurity plan. And then if something were to sneak in, we want to make sure that we can prevent the spread. If one animal gets infected, how can we keep that animal from spreading it to the others? And we're going to talk about that a lot more when we talk about humans here in a minute. And then we want to monitor things. And this is the importance of those records. I want to be able to come into that herd and see, did the plan that I came up with back at the top of this slide, is it working? Or are things still sneaking in? Are we having some issues there? And how am I going to manage those? So now we're going to talk a little bit about humans, actually. And most people don't think of themselves as part of a herd, but as a human being, you certainly are a part of a herd. You're a part of your herd at home with your family. You're a part of a herd in your classroom. Your school is a larger herd. Your city is a herd. Your county, state, United States, and really as a world, we're a herd. A herd is just a group of animals, and that is exactly what we are, and we function not unlike a group of cattle. The decision that one of us makes affects the whole group of us, potentially. Someone in your classroom makes a decision, it affects everyone else. Someone in your classroom comes in carrying the flu, that's going to affect everybody, and so it functions exactly the same way that a cow herd does. And so human health depends on people moving in and out, that concept of biosecurity that we talked about. Individual resistance is important. I talked a little bit about my dad never gets sick, the rest of us always get sick. Disease biology is important here. how are diseases that are common in the human herd, how are they transmitted? How can we prevent that? We need to have some knowledge there about how that occurs. The environment that people are in. People who are in certain dusty environments are predisposed to certain diseases. There are certain parts of the country where certain fungal diseases are very common, so we need to know about that as well. Nutrition, as I said, extremely important, and then stress. We know that stress plays a significant role in how people respond to disease. And so when we think about particularly infectious diseases, we want to break the cycle of transmission. If we know that people are sneezing into their hands and then touching everything in the classroom, touching doorknobs in particular, that's going to be how it's spread. So that's why we tell you, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. And so all of those things help to break that cycle of transmission. We would like to kill the infectious agent once it's in there. This is where disinfectants are important. Go through hospitals, they go through classrooms. In our clinic, we wipe everything down with the disinfectant after every patient, and we want to kill the infectious agent so that the next animal or person who passes by that area then does not have the opportunity to pick that up. We'd also like to increase host resistance wherever possible, and the biggest ways to do this are nutrition, reducing stress, and certainly vaccination is a way to do that. There's not a lot we can do about genetics at this point. We certainly are, I think, working towards that as a society to increase individual resistance in that way. But right now, nutrition, stress, and vaccination are the kind of the big three weapons that we have to increase host resistance. And so there's this concept called community immunity, and besides the fact that it is kind of a cool term, what this is referring to is the idea that a certain percentage of the people or animals in a population have some protective resistance, usually through vaccination. Community immunity is most often used with regards to talking about vaccination. It is where a number of people in a population are vaccinated against a disease, and by a certain percentage of the people being protected, that then protects the whole community. And I'll show you a graphic here in a minute that will kind of show that. But what I hope you leave here with today is that, for example, by being vaccinated against I keep using the flu because it's a great example that we all know about. By being vaccinated for the flu, I not only protect myself from the flu, but I also protect the people who are immediately around me. And so again, we talked about the herd. One person makes a decision, it affects the herd. The decision to become vaccinated also protects the herd in very much the same way. And so here's a picture. The blue people are people who are not immunized but are apparently healthy. So they're walking around, they haven't been vaccinated, but they're still healthy. And then the little yellow people are immunized and healthy. So these are people who have been vaccinated and don't apparently have the disease. And then the red people are not immunized, they've become infected, and now they're considered contagious. So we got that legend down. So if you look on the top left sort of quadrant there, you have lots of the blue people, they haven't been vaccinated, and they're healthy. But two little people snuck into that group who weren't immunized but are carrying whatever the disease we're talking about is. And because the blue people aren't vaccinated, it rapidly spreads to them. They move over to the right-hand side now, and we have a large percentage of the people who are now infected and contagious, and only a few blue people remain. And those blue people then are these that have some inherent individual resistance like we talked about. Something about them allows them, they either didn't really get exposed or they have some inherent protection against the disease. And so this is how a highly infectious disease can spread in a population of people. It can do this in a population of cows, it can do it in a population of rabbits. They're not protected, the disease sneaks in, and it sort of spreads like wildfire through them, and you end up with lots and lots of people sick. Then if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you see that we have lots of yellow people in there who are vaccinated. We have some blue folks who are not vaccinated but are healthy. And then we have those same two people who are carrying the disease. They get into a population like that where the population is largely protected, has been vaccinated, and you see the disease doesn't really spread significantly. And the thing I would point out here is if you look at the blue folks, you're going to see that out of the 4 of them on the left-hand side, only 1 of them actually gets sick over in the right-hand side. And that's this concept that I was talking about, where by vaccinating myself, I protect the people around me. When I get infected with a bacteria or a virus, that replicates in my body or makes lots of copies of itself. And then through my nose or saliva or however it's transmitted, for as gross as that is, it gets spread to the people around me. It's just the way disease spreads. If I am vaccinated, that bacteria or virus comes into me, and it is limited in its ability to replicate then, because my immune system is going to keep that from happening. So by being vaccinated myself, I am keeping what was 1 bacteria from becoming 1 million, if that makes sense. And so that's why in that picture, not all of the unprotected blue people get sick, because the yellow people around him are not amplifying the disease and allowing it to spread like wildfire. So the yellow people have protected themselves, and they protected 3 out of those 4 blue people. And this becomes really important, especially in human health, because there are certain populations of people who can't be vaccinated for some reason or another. They may have some inherent disease or inherent susceptibility where vaccinating them is risky. And so when that occurs, it is the responsibility of those around them who can become vaccinated to do so as a mechanism of protecting them as well. So we've kind of already talked around this topic. Infection occurs when viruses, bacteria, fungus, fungi, those sorts of things invade the body and then sort of set up shop there, and then they begin to replicate, and then that allows them to be spread between animals, between humans. Our body, these bad guys sort of come in, viruses, bacteria, those sorts of things, come into us, they set up shop in our bodies, they go through a number of processes there, and they rapidly make copies of themselves. And that's how bacteria and viruses survive. That's their mechanism of staying with us on this earth, is to make lots of copies and get spread around. And that's what they want to do. They want to go to the next guy and make 1 million more copies in my neighbor, just like they did in me. And so this is kind of a complicated diagram of sort of the molecular way that occurs. But the point there is that when I get infected, my body then has the opportunity, unfortunately, to send out many copies of that same bacteria or virus and infect my neighbors around me. One of the things of innate immunity that we have is our intact skin. Our skin protects us from certain infectious agents. When we have a cut, we have a hangnail, something like that, it can allow bacteria or other things to invade that and give us an infection at that site. Our GI tract is designed to protect us. Our stomach has acid in it, so that if we swallow a bacteria or a virus, we hope that it will get killed there before it has the opportunity to cause a problem. Our respiratory tract is designed the same way, and our urinary and reproductive tracts are that way as well. I've alluded to that vaccines are kind of a weakened or a killed version of that infectious agent, the virus or the bacteria, and so we are asking our bodies then, when we take a vaccine, to respond to that and develop specific acquired immunity towards that bacteria or virus, so that if we meet that virus again, if my neighbor sheds that virus onto me at some point, my body is sort of prepared for it because it's had that vaccine before. These antibodies, which is what our body produces in response to vaccines primarily, there are other cells that come in and provide that as well. These antibodies remain in our body for sometimes weeks, months, years, depends on the agent that we're talking about, and the goal is that they would stop the infectious organism if we're ever presented with that again, and keep it from multiplying. current areas of research with regards to disease transmission. We don't know everything we would like to know about disease biology. We don't know everything we would like to know about how viruses spread or how bacteria spread, how they survive in certain environments where we believe that they shouldn't be able to survive. Don't know everything that we should know about the immune system. It's very complicated, and we're learning more all the time about how people and animals respond to vaccines and to infection. And then we also don't know enough about the impact of outside factors. So how does stress really affect us? How does nutrition really affect us? How does our environment really affect us? Those all are very important considerations. We have a handle on some general concepts with those, but there's a lot more that we have to learn over time. So finally, it looks like we maybe just have 2 or 3 minutes left, and so we can open it up for questions. I've got some folks here in the room with me. They may have questions, or if we have questions from the classroom, I'm happy to take those.
All right. We have 2 interactive sites today, River Road High School and Coosa Valley. And if either of those sites would like to ask Dr. Jones a question about something from today's discussion, please unmute your mic, tell us your name and where you're from, and ask Dr. Jones a question. Okay, we have a question from our classroom in the studio.
You mentioned there's not antibiotics for all or vaccinations for all diseases. Why not?
So I have a great question. The question is, I said that there aren't vaccines for every disease, and he wants to know why not. And that's actually a really great question. There are a number of reasons. One is diseases that aren't very common will often not have a vaccine made for them simply because there isn't enough market for that disease. It costs a lot of money to develop a vaccine, and so you need to know that you're going to be able to sell enough doses of that vaccine in order to make it worth your while to develop it. The other thing is there simply are some bacteria, viruses, parasites that don't make a vaccine well, that they have worked, and for some reason they don't grow like they're supposed to, they don't behave like they're supposed to, and that this kind of goes back to that disease biology thing, that there are things we don't know. There are certain bacteria and viruses and other infectious agents that when you make a vaccine from them, they just don't work very well. And there's a lot we need to learn in that area. So those are the main 2 reasons.
What are some disadvantages of giving vaccines?
Okay, so that's a great question. What are some disadvantages of giving vaccines? We certainly know that there's no procedure that we do in animal or human medicine that is completely without risk. And so when we think about cattle, some of the risks really inherently are handling them. Cattle don't love being handled, particularly if they're out on the range, and so certainly just the process of putting them through a chute, that's always a risk. Specific to the vaccines themselves, we are stimulating immune response, and so some animals will get a fever after getting a vaccine, and sometimes that may make them miss a few meals. They may not feel very good. Some of you may have experienced that yourselves. You just don't feel very good the day after getting a vaccine. Some people are sensitive or allergic to vaccines. In order to make people and animals respond well to these, there are some compounds in here that really stimulate the immune response. And some people are allergic to those, just like some people are allergic to peanut butter, those sorts of things. And so that is always a risk as well. And so we have to look at an individual person's risk for developing the disease versus the risk of perhaps the use of the vaccine when we think about those kinds of things.
Do small farms need to have all these plans for biosecurity and herd health too, or if I have a few cows, do I really have to care about it?
That's a great question too. That's really great. She asked, do small farms, maybe with 10, 15, 20 animals, do they need to have a herd health plan? Do they need to be concerned about this? And I would certainly argue that those need it as much, if not more, than the large herds do, simply because they may be more susceptible. They are sometimes more often to bring animals in and out. They're kind of constantly adding to the herd or moving animals around. That tends to be a behavior of small herds. And certainly, you know, if you have 2 animals in a herd of 20 that get ill, it's much more devastating than 2 animals out of a herd of 1,000 that get sick. And so the disease risk in small herds is every bit as much a concern as it is in large herds. And certainly when I think of some of my clients, it may even be more of a concern than in a large herd. That's a good question.
Currently, in a lot of our popular media or mainstream media, we're seeing people who are opposed to use of antibiotics, vaccinations, other medications in food animals. Is there a reason to be concerned with this, or is this just a current hype on some particular issue?
Yeah. So there are, and I certainly am a food animal veterinarian, and so I'm well aware of these concerns for the public. They don't like the idea of there being medications in cattle. What I would say is that, as I alluded to in the talk, we can never completely reduce disease risk down to zero. And so unfortunately, there will be cattle that get sick, there will be sheep that get sick, there will be goats that get sick from time to time. And so in order to be able to raise them humanely and to keep them comfortable during their illness, we need the ability to use certain medications in them in order to prevent their suffering. Now, the concern always is, if people are then subsequently going to eat this animal, is it going to have that drug left in its body? And what I will tell you is there is a concept called the slaughter withholding, and what that is a period of time at which we do not slaughter an animal for food after it has received a medication. And for every medication that we use in them, we know what that time is. So for example, a very commonly used antibiotic has a 28-day slaughter withholding on it. So if I give an injection of that antibiotic to that animal today, I know that that animal cannot then be slaughtered for food for 28 days after the dose I give today. And what that allows for is, we know the duration of that drug in that animal's body is going to be 28 days. And if I slaughter it after 28 days, that is gone. And so any drug that gets used in food animals has a slaughter withholding on it that is observed. And that's a really important concept to understand, that we do have plans in place to make sure that when those animals go into the food supply, there is not drug left in them. We have to be able to use drugs because we need to be able to keep animals comfortable and prevent suffering when disease does sneak into the herd.
Why is it on a dairy cow, as soon as she gives birth, you can't use that milk for human consumption for a couple of days?
Yeah, so the question is, if you weren't able to hear it, was when a dairy cow gives birth, we don't use the first milk for about 3 to 4 days after the calf is born. That milk that's produced can't be used for human consumption. And the reason for that is, in all animals, not just dairy cows, the first milk that is produced after birth is called colostrum. And it has very high levels of protein and immunity in it that is designed to be then given to the calf. It's really thick, and I don't know, but probably doesn't taste very good. I've never tasted it. And so the first milk that comes out of any animal, the first day or two, or actually out to maybe 3 or 4 days in most animals, is actually not really milk. It is milk, but it's kind of supercharged with a lot of protein and immunity that's designed to protect that calf early in its life from disease. So it's kind of like vaccine for the calf. And so that milk is unfit for human consumption because it's not milk like what you and I want to drink as milk. It's a little more thick and soupy. So,
How long will that immunity from the mother's milk, from the colostrum, how long will the offspring retain that immunity? Is this a lifelong effect, or will it eventually fade away?
yeah, this is actually kind of cool, I think. We know that colostral immunity is present in calves out to about 5, 6, 7 months of age, that protection will still be there. And we know that getting good colostral immunity protects a calf from disease out to even over a year of age. So this is an extremely important concept in immunity, sort of that first protection that they get from their mom right after birth, really potentially affects them throughout their entire lives.
You mentioned you go to a herd this afternoon. If you do a necropsy on a cow, what would be the value of that? Because that cow is already dead anyhow.
Okay, So he asked a question about if we go out to a herd and we perform a necropsy. And necropsy is the term we use for basically an autopsy that's done on animals. It's the same thing. And so if I go out, I have a client that has an animal that dies, and I go out and perform an autopsy or a necropsy on that animal, the value of that is, and what he said was, what's the value of that if that animal's already dead? And the value is that from that necropsy, I should be able to determine, is this a disease that only affected that animal, or is this a disease that may affect the rest of the herd? And so it's not going to be able to help that animal. You're absolutely correct. But I can help the other 100 animals in the herd by determining, is this something that could be infectious to the rest of the herd? And if so, what is it? And how can I protect the remainder of the crew from getting that? So it's really about necropsying the individual animal is really about protecting the whole herd.
We have time for one last question. If Coosa Valley or River Road would like to ask us a question, please go ahead now. If we have no questions from them, we'll have one last question.
Why do you want to be a veterinarian?
Well, that's a great question. It's one of the most common questions we get asked. Why did we decide to become a veterinarian? I will say that my dad is a retired veterinarian, and so I grew up around veterinary medicine and animals and the people who own animals. And but that certainly isn't what made the decision for me. For me, I really love science. I love math and chemistry and biology and all of those sorts of things. And veterinary medicine is a really great way to combine the love of animals, the love of science in general, the love of biology, and then the desire to serve people through their animals. It's kind of all wrapped into one. And so for me, that was the decider. Was I'd been around it, I knew that I loved it, and so I selected to be part.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for being with us today and for that very interesting discussion on immunity and herd health. Who knew that humans were part of a herd? If you'd like to know more about science, veterinary science, or ag science, please remember to visit our website at peer.tamu.edu. We look forward to seeing you at the next video conference series brought to you by Texas A&M University College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences.